Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, taking off, then if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming here Professor Robert Faff. Robert Faff is one of the top finance thought leaders in the world. He is research professor convenience University of Budapest. He has an international reputation in finance research, scaling more than $4 million dollars in national competitions grant, more than 300 referred journals publication. He is editor-in-chief of Pacific Basin Finance Journals. Now we will start our seminar with dear Professor Robert Pratt.
Okay, thank you very much. Lovely to be here, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you on, I guess, my favorite topic. So I'm going to share my screen, and all right, just bear with me. I apologize. Screen that I wanted. I think it's a problem of having too many things open. We'll try again. There, and there. Okay. So as I said, very nice to be with you. I think we're spread across a lot of different time zones. So for me right now, it's quite late. It's a little bit after 11 p.m. Here in on the east coast of Australia. As I said, it's a great pleasure to talk to you on my favorite topic these days, which is pitching research, the pitching research framework that really I've been dedicating my academic life to for over 10 years now. And I've lost track how many times I've given a talk like this. It must be around 500 occasions over 11 years. The version of the talk I'm going to give tonight, I'm quite excited about. It might surprise you that over all this time that I feel like that I've developed something new and added something new to the presentation, but in fact, that's exactly the case, and I want to explain a little bit about that in the next 60 minutes or so. And I've got a subtitle for the presentation which hints at the novel part. This is the first time that I've presented this version, the so-called PRF, the Pitching Research Framework Design Ecosystem. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this, and as we'll see shortly, in fact, I will go to well, before I go to that, because there are some parts to this the PRF ecosystem, but I just wanted a little plug for the Inspires Centre for Responsible Science. A little bit like Mohamed was telling me earlier before the session that this webinar series was initiated this during the COVID period. And why am I mentioning that? Because during the COVID period, what I initiated was this network, the Inspires Research Network. And I guess we all reacted differently in terms of what we were doing with our time during this very strange period. And so I've given many talks and many online talks and many in-person talks in the name of Inspires. And a few years later, after establishing the Inspires Research Network, I decided that it needed a virtual centre, so the Inspires Centre for Responsible Science. And currently this map is a little bit out of date. We have about 80 node leaders around the world. So there are about 10 nodes in Africa. So I visited Africa for 3.5 weeks, about a month and a half ago, and I visited several of my nodes. So I have a very strong node leader down at Stellenbosch University, Messius Alpheus. I also visited David Mathuva at Strathmore University in Nairobi, and I gave a keynote speech for the African Accounting and Finance Association, which was held in Kampala, Uganda. And I met one of my other node leaders there, Bonnie Kagaba. And earlier this year, I was also in Africa, in Morocco in April. I did a 2-day doctoral uh, 2-day doctoral event there, and I was talking about the pitching research framework there as well. So what I've been trying to do, both in person, as I've just described to you, as well as online, is spread the reach of research training, responsible research training, responsible science research training, and capacity building. And so tonight's presentation is just another step in that direction. So if you like, sponsored by the Inspire Centre for Responsible Science. If anyone online is interested in maybe signing up or learning more about the centre, this virtual centre, and maybe running a node somewhere in the far reaches of the globe, I'd be happy to hear from you. A little bit of an acknowledgement here, transparency and acknowledgement. There's a number of research papers that I've been working on, and these are research training papers really for the Inspires group, the Inspires Centre. And what I've been experimenting with quite successfully over the last couple of years is using ChatGPT as a collaborative tool. And that's another topic of discussion, which we won't be able to mention tonight due to time constraints. But over a period of time and over a sequence of iterated chats, I've been quite excited by the ability to generate training materials. And so I'm going to draw upon 3 relatively recent training materials that feed into this ecosystem that I was mentioning, this pitching research framework ecosystem. So we've got the Inspires Research Training Note number 5, number 14, and number 15. And as I've clearly indicate at the beginning of each of those working papers, the use of ChatGPT has been very significant. And so I just wanted to draw attention to that as well in this talk, because I'm drawing from a lot of that material. So what is this ecosystem about? It has 3 layers. It has 3 layers. So it's the pitching research framework, the PRF design ecosystem. So it's a design of communicating research ideas to anyone really, but often I think about a very common and important situation where a PhD student wants to communicate their ideas with their supervisor. And so layer 1 is the bedrock layer. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that I've given a talk like tonight, or depending on where you are, it's not tonight. For me, it's tonight. I've given this talk, probably 500 times, and the vast majority of these have always resided in layer 1, the bedrock. And the bedrock is basically a talk that just explains what the pitching research framework is, and I'm going to go into that shortly, fairly briefly, I would say. My goal in today's talk is not to inundate you with a lot of detail and sort of detailed discussions, but to give you a flavor across these 3 layers indeed, and that hopefully that will encourage you, excite you, and give you an incentive offline and over the coming weeks and over your career actually to delve into this further. So I'm giving you a resource. These slides I've already shared with Mohamed, and I've asked him to share them widely with you because they'll be very, for those of you that are interested, they'll be very helpful because there's a lot of links that I have in the slides that you can click on when you get the slides. So as I said, that layer 1's this bedrock. What is the PRF? There's 2 further layers, and these are relatively recent extensions of the PRF, particularly layer 3, but layer 2 is what I call the radial model, and it's a way of thinking of how you can get the PRF, this framework, to work for you, how the PRF works in a logical sense. So it's this, as this slide suggests, this radial architecture. And then layer 3 is very, very new. I've been working on this only in the last couple of weeks, and we've landed on the idea of amping up, of situations where if you're using the pitching research framework and you know how it works, but you actually now want to try and improve your research, so you've got a base to start with, you want to amp up that research. How would you go about it? What advice can I give you? And I think I can give you some fairly helpful advice. So we're sort of thinking about this as how the PRF grows. So in the next 55 minutes or so, we're going to just give you a flavor of each of these to get a feel for what they're about, just scratch at the surface really, but hopefully that's enough for you to think, wow, over the fullness of time, I need to look at these, and it would be this ordering. I wouldn't jump, if you're very new to the pitching research framework, you've got to spend some time at that layer 1 in bedrock. You don't jump to the amplification suite, layer 3. So it is really an ordered process depending on your exposure already to the pitching research framework. If you've already had a great exposure to it, then you could move to layer 2 and then to layer 3. So let's have a look at this. So with the layer 1, it's the bedrock paper, and I think I did send some advice out ahead of time for this webinar that it would be good pre-reading, and I suspect some of you have done that. You've accessed the paper and you've done the pre-reading, and so this is sort of the core of what the framework's about. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes to talk about that. And I guess it needs to be done. I can't assume that everyone would know about the framework. It needs to be done. Now, what I've landed on relatively recently is this catchphrase of, well, the PRF is making the obvious, or maybe it's making the obvious more obvious. What I mean by that, well, when you cast your eye down the left-hand column, so there are 11 items there, we have this situation. If someone tells you something where you think, oh, I've heard of that before, I've heard of that, I've heard of it all, that it's obvious. And so that's something that I have to battle with, or I feel that I have to battle with whenever I present this material, because it's easy to sort of, as a receiver of this, it's easy for you to think, oh, he's telling me something I already know. It's so obvious. But my argument is, well, yeah, it's obvious in the little pieces and the fragments that you stumble across over a period of time. what this is doing is making it obvious in a very structured way, in a very helpful way, in a way that really leverages with extreme power, I think a tool that can help advance research, make it of higher quality, and speed it up, not by having shortcuts. So what are the 11 items? What are the obvious things? So we've got the first four, the four big picture anchors. So the working title, the research question, key papers, and the motivation. And what I argue when I have more time to dig deeply in this, and what I argue in the written paper, which is the Pitching Research Bedrock paper, which is now in version 19, is that these first four items are like putting context to your research. So think of it as you're hovering slightly above what your research is actually about. So it's the big picture. And the big picture is important because if you're trying to communicate with your supervisor, for example, if we want to take that scenario, the supervisor needs you to help them understand, well, where this is situated, where the research is situated. And they may well already understand that anyway. The related part of this is they want to have confidence that you understand where this is situated. So that's what those first four items are largely about, in my opinion. From then on, we go to the elements of your research. So no longer hovering, and at the heart, the engine room of your research are the three essential building blocks. This is where you essentially define how your research is going to work. How your research is going to work. Well, in terms of the how, you have to have an idea. You have to have an intellectual idea. So what is the intellectual idea at the very center of your research? And in quantitative research, for example, it's quite common, but not always the case, but it is quite common that you would have a hypothesis or a prediction. So this is where I would expect the hypothesis or prediction to surface. Now, that's not to say that's the only thing that would constitute the idea, but it's certainly a central piece of a quantitative pitch and the idea. Now, the two other related building blocks are data and tools. Now, almost all of us are going to be empirical researchers. Now, if you're a theoretical researcher, then this template, this framework will be less useful to you because it's clearly designed with empirical research in mind. We see it there with data. So what are the data that you're going to collect? What's the sample that you are going to draw from that data? What's the sampling strategy that you're going to use? Do you have a representative sample? Is it large enough? Is it gold standard? Is it at the gold standard of the research in your field? So these are all questions that we need to think about and that we need to articulate and communicate to our research collaborators, our research colleagues, and if we're a PhD student, to our PhD supervisor. Now, the third element, of course, are the tools. So if you've got an idea and you've got data, what do you have? You can't stop there. That's not going to give us any evidence that we can point to around the research that we're doing. So it's all around a nucleus of the research question, and the tools will be those methods that allow us to perform the analysis. We're going to analyze the data in an acceptable and robust fashion that puts into play the idea, the intellectual idea, And why are we doing this? We're trying to come up with our offering in terms of at least a partial answer to the question. Now, we pose a question, a research question. We very rarely, if ever, have an answer, a clear answer to that question. If we have a very successful research project, we might come up with quite an interesting partial answer to that question, and that's a pretty good outcome. So we have the three essential building blocks there at the heart of the pitch. After that, we move on to some further things that are really important to think about in terms of formulating your research project. We have the two key questions. So the two key questions are, well, what's new, which is novelty. So in what way and how, and in a meaningful way, is our research going to provide something that's a little bit different, it's new, it's novel compared to what currently exists? Now, this will tie back in to some extent with the motivation, because the motivation will be, if you like, setting the big picture scene for a piece of the puzzle that we're arguing is still yet to be resolved at the motivation level. And then the what's new is our contribution, our offering to partially meet that demand around the motivation. So we should never have this set up such that we're arguing that what we're offering, the new thing, is a total satisfaction of the missing piece in the motivation. That never happens, and that's quite I guess, a pointless exercise in terms of writing up and developing one's research. Novice researchers can, I believe, be fooled into thinking if you've found something new, all of your troubles are over. That's all you need to find, something new and novel, and you can relax then. Wrong. There's many, many things that we could agree are new and novel, but people would shrug their shoulders and say, so what? So the second allied question that we need to think about very carefully, very seriously, and very early on is, why does this matter? Why is it important? How will decisions change? How will decision makers alter their behavior? What is going to be impacted that wouldn't be so if we had not done our research? So what's new and so what are the two key questions? And this, I think, often then should lead us to the holy grail, the one bottom line, which is, well, what's the contribution? Now, we're in the business of creating knowledge. And so I often think of the contribution as having this strong link back to knowledge creation. So we've situated our research along a particular stream of evolving pieces of work, and we want to add to that. We want to be part of that. So how is knowledge being created, or the potential for knowledge creation coming from our research? And that's really the call from contribution. And then the final element, the 11th, is a catch-all. It's basically saying, well, there are other things that we should think about that aren't covered in the 10 items above. And these are, things like, well, what's the target journal? What's your publication strategy, if you like? And don't fall for the trap of setting aspirations. My publication strategy is Journal of Finance, if you're a finance researcher. If you're an accounting researcher, my publication strategy is Accounting Review. If you're an economics researcher, my publication strategy is economics, oh gosh, American economic, anyway, one of the tier 1 journals in economics. I've had a bit of a brain fade. I'm going to blame it being a little bit too late. So there are these other considerations. Target journals are not the only one. We can think about research risks and other constraints. I guess one of the ways or sort of angles on other considerations that I think is quite helpful is to think of the constraints that you face in your research. They may be time constraints, maybe ethics constraints. You can think of, I guess, the journals as another form of constraint over your research. Couple of other comments quickly about the bedrock before I move on to layer 2 and layer 3 of the ecosystem, the PRF ecosystem. I often say, and I'm going to say now, that it's a word constrained challenge that you face. So one of the things that's important to recognize is if you want to communicate your ideas to others, there's a limited attention span, and with a supervisor, a limited time they have available to to absorb what you're communicating to them. So in written form, I think 1,000 words is about the right target. So 1,000-word pitch, plus or minus 20%, 2 pages if you like, is about what you should be striving for. And that, at a general level, there's the 5 golden rules. That you should be as clear and as focused and to the point as you can. It should be meaningful rather than superficial. It should reflect that you put in effort rather than you're being lazy. It should show up as being a connected, cohesive, and coherent whole, so that there's internal connection across all the 11 elements. And then the final one is, well, that the success will be that you start a conversation. So if you think again of the PhD student with a supervisor, the goal is not perfection. Perfection is a mirage. So the goal is to start a conversation. It's about communicating your ideas to someone that you want advice from. So what I've also done in recent times, and some of this was COVID inspired, was that I delved deeper and drilled deeper into the 11 elements of the framework. And so some of these papers that go into, I guess, just giving more advice and more specifics around the different elements. You can see some of these were written during those COVID years, and some of these actually were also written post the advent of ChatGPT. So on several of those papers, I used ChatGPT to help write them, and I acknowledge that very clearly in the beginning of each of those. So that's really important. You've got to take ownership. You've got to acknowledge and show, I guess, honesty and research ethics around the use of such assistance. Right, so let's move on to layer 2, which is what we've describing here as the radial architecture. And so this is the paper, the Inspires Research Training Note number 5, where we've developed this radial logic, which sounds a bit mystical, and I'm going to try and explain to you at least the flavor of this that will help you understand what it's about and how it can help. So I guess a good background for understanding what was on my mind when, and this was one of the papers that I did collaborate with ChatGPT. What was on my mind here was that it's not, you can give something like an 11-item list, and it looks like a form. It looks like you've got to fill in a form, and I've not met anyone in the world that loves filling in forms. I hate it with a passion. So what was bugging me when I was presenting the bedrock was it seemed like I was giving people advice on how to fill in a form. You know, there are we labeled each item alphabetically, so A through to K. It's like, well, just go through and fill in the form, and seems to me that's psychologically not a great way to present the material, and not entirely helpful for someone that's starting out. I'd come up later with, well, actually, it was quite early in the piece of the idea of a cocktail glass metaphor, where it's a 4, 3, 2, 1 plus 1, and I had on a previous slide that I flicked past it, but a cocktail glass to indicate that you start wide and you funnel down in terms of the use. But again, I was always dissatisfied by that, and the radial model was really trying to address, well, if you're going to use the pitching research framework, how would you use it? How, for example, where would you start? So if you've got the form filling mentality, it's like start at the top and just work down sequentially. And well, it's not to say that won't work, but there might actually be a more sensible way to go. And so what the radial model is doing is addressing the question, if I want to create a pitch, where and how should I start? Is there a logical sequence to follow? Should I start at A, work successively through, as I've just said? And my answer to that is definitively no. One of the reasons is you are already setting yourself up for a negative experience, because it's like you're filling in a form, and we don't want it to be that experience. It should be an exciting experience. It should be one where you feel that you are developing and advancing your research in a really exciting way. So then what advice? Well, the radial model, and on this diagram, it looks a little bit like a dartboard, which is possibly unhelpful, because darts is a bit like random. And you're always aiming for, well, you're not always aiming for the bullseye, of course, but bullseye is often seen as sort of the goal of this. But there are 3 layers in this circular sort of radial model. And so at the bullseye, in the sweet spot at the center, is the core anchor. And that's at the heart, I think, of how one should view the use of the pitching research framework. And that core anchor is the research question. Okay. If you don't have a clear idea of what the research question is, how can you possibly advance and know where to go beyond that? It just doesn't make sense. So you have that core anchor, the research question, and it's not like you have to definitively know what that is, but you have to have a pretty good comfort factor that the research question is something is sustainable, at least for the development of your research. Once you have that anchor, that core anchor, the research question, you move to the foundational level, which is the middle ring. And the foundational level is where the research design elements come in. So they are under your control, directly under your control. So what are these foundational elements? They are item C, key papers; D, motivation; E, the idea; F, the data; and G, the tool. So there's 6, if you like, levers. So these are levers that you can and that you need to think about and work through, that link to the research question. So all of this will link back to the research question. So around the nucleus of the research question, what are the key papers, the motivation, the idea, the data, and the tools? And they're the foundational elements. That's a research design that is up to the researcher to figure out. And it's not like you're going to figure it out in one shot. The other thing to bear in mind here is an iterative, recursive process where, as you develop your thinking and your ideas, you should see these changing in a way that is converging you to something that is better than what you had when you started. Then we have level 3. And level 3 is what we've termed the derivative level. And this, the term comes from it, these derive from. They derive their existence from the other two levels. So the what's new, the so what, the contribution, the other considerations, and the working title. They have to, they're sort of functions of the other two. So that the other two levels, the research question and the research design elements. And so to me, I think that's quite instructive in terms of you start at the core and you work out. You do it iteratively. You don't do it as a one-shot exercise. And you would not start with the outer level because they derive from decisions you make about the research question and the design. So they are truly derivative. So this table is taken from that radial model paper, and it just gives, I guess, another sort of related angle to what I've been saying. And I guess the most interesting part of this will be the right-hand column, the role of each of the item in the design logic. So with the research question, which is at the core, remember that's level 1. That's the core epistemic anchor. It's the anchor for your research. Then we have the green level 2. So key papers, this is scholarly positioning. The motivation, it's the academic, real world and policy relevance. The idea, the novel conceptual framing. Data, empirical foundation, and tools, the analytical engine. Excuse me. Okay, and then we have the blue level 3. So what's new, the claim novelty, so what, the significance, contribution, the academic relevance and integration. The other considerations, the practical and ethical feasibility, the constraints, if you like. And then working title, even though it was at the top of the list for the way the PRF is designed, this is something that almost you leave. You could have a placeholder working title, but the working title will reflect and be a reflective packaging of the final design. And it is a derivative. If it's a good working title, it's a derivative of everything else, at least the layer 1 and layer 2 of the radial, in terms of the radial model. Okay, so the interesting thing about this slide, the one thing I wanted to mention is the 3 elements highlighted in green from level 3, the what's new, so what, and contribution, are the most interesting in the sense that they are like the objective that you're trying to, in a sense, optimize over. So in terms of decisions you make in terms of the research question, that's level 1, or level 2, which are the foundational sort of research design pieces, you can think of the decisions you're making and the design you're making there as having an effect on the objective, which is to have a package of something that is as novel as you can make it, as important as you can make it, and as something that's contributing is adding to the stock of knowledge. And so I think that's quite instructive as well. Now, the other thing we do in the radial model, and I should pause now just to emphasize something that I said right at the beginning of this talk. If you're new to the pitching research framework, don't be too concerned about where we are right now. This might seem quite involved and quite abstract. This is something for you to consider down the track once you've got had some experience to just trying out the pitching research framework, so that you don't get too hung up with what I'm saying now until you're at a level that you can cope with it. And so if you were at that level, what I would be saying to you is, well, think of it as having two phases, this radial model. The first is like an exploratory phase, an exploratory assembly. And that's basically, the way of thinking of what this is about is figure out your research question. That's at the core. That's the anchor. Then the foundational items. So the research design, the next 5. And once you've done that, a way of assessing how good your pitch is to then think about, well, what do those 6 things mean or lead to in terms of the objective, the 3-dimensional objective, which is what's new, so what, and the contribution. And in other words, see what pops out. And, it's not like you would do this exercise totally ignoring those. They would feed into decisions you make, even at the exploratory stage. But the exploratory stage then that puts you in a position of, well, and most likely you're a little disappointed. Let's say you go through the exercise, the exploratory exercise, and you come to the realization the novelty is not that great, or the importance is not that great, or the contribution is not that great. Now, it's not like you can measure these things. They're somewhat, very judgmental and qualitative in nature, but we can make a call on them. We can get advice. Our supervisor will give us advice. And in the exploratory setting, the supervisor might say, well, your picture's okay, but it doesn't amount to much novelty, and you need more novelty. And you go, well, okay, gosh, what have I got to do? Well, let me tell you what the thing that you don't do, or the direction that you don't follow, and that is to go away and think, oh, I've just got to sit down and think of another way of writing, expressing the novelty. So, in other words, I'm not going to change anything apart from changing the novelty. That won't work. It's not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is the only logical way you can improve the novelty is to go back to the other 2 layers. Now, your research question at the anchor, the core, might be okay. You might not have to fiddle with that or change that. But in order to get a better objective, better impact, if you like, and here we're thinking of the case of the supervisor says there's not enough novelty. The way to achieve that in a real and meaningful sense is to think of how you can change and alter your research design so that it achieves the better novelty. Okay. And that then feeds into phase 2, which is to move from the exploratory assembly phase to saying, all right, I'm now going to use this radial model to, as a strategic optimization. So how can I get the best out of my design? Okay, so what do I need to change in either, the research question, which is the anchor, the core, or the foundational layer. So what, in those levels 1 and 2, what do I need to change in order to do better on at least one of the three derivative, the core, I guess, impact derivative elements of what's new, so what, and contribution. So what do I need to change? How can I change level 1 and level 2 elements of my research plan so that I do better on at least one of those, if not all three, the what's new, the so what, and contribution. Okay, and that's really the strategic optimization phase. But something we need to take into account in all of this are constraints. So we face constraints. So it's not like we can change things and just ignore the fact that, hey, the data might not exist, because one of our thoughts might be, oh, well, I can improve the novelty by having better data, bigger data set, some other fancy new data set or whatever. But if there's a constraint that you're facing, for example, the data do not exist, that's a pretty serious constraint, or they might exist, but for you at your institution, they may not exist. You may not have, it could be commercially available data, but your university doesn't pay the subscription. So the constraints are sort of reality that you need to keep your eye on as well. So in the exploratory phase, the mindset is open, curious, generative. The goal is establish a viable, internally coherent structure. And the key focus is on the two, the center level, the first level, the research question, and then that foundational ring, item C to G. So when you think about the transition to phase 2, you're trying to activate this strategic mindset. The goal shifts from viability to some type of maximization, optimization. So to give you, maybe to now it's a little too abstract. You're thinking, well, what does this mean in sort of reality? So the questions that I have on this slide are trying to pierce through that abstractness and give you an idea of sort of more the realistic questions that you might pose. So the researcher asks questions like, can this design be sharpened to offer clearer novelty? Can I reframe or extend the idea to deepen its significance? Would a different method, data set, or positioning improve contribution? But remember what I said a little earlier, and that is you need to remember the constraints. So if you're going to do something around data, you have to be very confident and know you have access, you have legal access to that data. And the fourth question there to give a little bit more reality to what I'm speaking about here is the question, is the project feasible given ethical, time, and resource constraints? All right, let me move on from that. This table is taken from the radial model paper, but I'm going to go on to layer 3 because I want to talk a little bit about the amplification suite. And both of these papers, and you can see I've got the citations here, the Delta framework, which is research training note number 14, it was uploaded to SSRN on the 8th of November, and I've got to remind myself, it's the 14th. It's the 14th of November now. 6 days ago. 6 days ago. So this is very, very fresh. And then the second one, so these are like a pair, and actually I've got in mind at least 2 additional papers to add to this, 2 other amping up papers. So the second one is amping up, And here it's focusing on the research idea. So and this does dovetail back to what we've just been talking about, which is if you feel that you've got you're not quite there, the novelty's not quite there, or the importance not quite there, or the contribution, you've got to do something with one of the 6 things. Now, one of them, and as well as we argue in this second paper, is idea is like a part of a golden triangle of 3 that give you sort of really good bang for your buck. And I'll mention that briefly in a minute, but the point I was going to make here, this paper, the Amping Up the Research Idea, Research Training Note number 15, I uploaded to the SSRN 2 days ago. 2 days ago. Now, I've already told you how I've been able to be so productive on creating these research training materials, and that is by very carefully and I believe cleverly working together and collaborating with AI, generative AI. Now, my choice is ChatGPT, and I think I don't know where it rates in terms of the competitors. I think it's competitive. The reason I use ChatGPT all the time is I pay a subscription, and I'm an old school sort of person that if I pay for something, I want to use it. So I do use it a lot, and I think like anything, if you use something a lot, and you can bring to the table some great advantage, some skills, let's say some existing knowledge, which I think I have, and the existing knowledge is around how research works. You can figure out how to get the greatest bang for your buck from generative AI. It's a hit and miss experience, and I'm astounded sometimes by how wonderful and great a series of answers, and I do a lot of iterative chatting. I don't take the very first thing. I'm astounded, pleasantly surprised and excited when the stream of ideas are developing better than I could ever imagine. But I've also experienced the other extreme of catastrophic fails. And catastrophic fails sometimes aren't that, if you're not confident about the expertise that you need to have that you're using. Now, in the case I'm often not so much worried about finance discipline stuff, but just the research process and how research works. If you're not on top of that, you might not recognize a categorical fail, because you'll always get something that's written in a pretty interesting and persuasive way. So I've diverted off a little bit there, but that is an interesting topic of discussion, which we don't have time for tonight, and that is, I guess, the responsible use of AI in research. And mostly I've used it in terms of developing research training materials. So it's allowed me to develop some pretty decent, I believe, research training materials. And you can see these are fresh and hot off the press. Now, what are they about? What is this amplification suite about? So how the PRF grows. Well, the Delta framework is focused on providing structured strategic iteration using the PRF levers. And so in these later works, the level 1 and level 2 in the radial model are what we are now calling in this new work, this Delta framework, a lever. And it gives you leverage over how you can improve the impact of your research. And the impact is a function of what's new, so what, and the contribution. All right, what's new, so what, and contribution. So just to sort of re-emphasize it again, if someone tells you that your contribution is not good enough, it's not a simple matter of going, oh, okay, I've just got to write it better. All right, let's assume you've written it as best you possibly could. You couldn't write it any better. It's very clear the level of contribution. And they still say your contribution is not enough. Then how do you fix that? The argument I have here is, using the pitching research framework, we have 6 levers. We have 6 ways of leveraging, changing our research. Why would we want to change? Because we're trying to improve contribution, or the what's new, or the so what. So that Delta framework is really getting us to think about those levers and how we do that in a structured and strategic way. And then following on from that, it seemed to me a couple of days ago that I can write something to give advice on, well, let's focus on some of these levers and say, well, if I have to amp up that item, how would you do it? What's advice I could give? And so I've started with the idea, because I think it's pretty central. It's not as, in a sense, central as the research question, but it's not far off. And so amping up the idea would be one way of trying to improve the impact, trying to improve something around the value that your research has. And what ChatGPT and I came to the conclusion was that it's not clear cut, and that we've got a 3x3 model in mind. At least the 3 dimensions I'm going to talk about on this slide is when to push, in other words, green light, when to pause, in other words, orange light, and when to avoid, in other words, red light. Okay, green, orange, red. And so it's not simply a matter of saying, oh, just push hard on the idea. That would be bad advice. There'll be circumstances in which it's a very good idea, it is a good idea to push. There'll be other circumstances where it's a bad idea, and some in the middle where you have to pause. So think of this as the turbocharger for responsible research ambition. Now, I'm just going to scratch at the surface here. We're really now at an advanced stage, in a sense, of how you can use the pitching research framework. So if you're very new to the pitching research framework in this session, don't be too concerned about layer 3 right now. Try and get a flavor of it right now. It's something for you to explore more seriously. I don't know, maybe in a month or 2 time, if you want to really try and get value out of the pitching research framework. You have to start with layer 1, the bedrock, then think about the radial model, and then once you've done that, and only then, you come to layer 3. You wouldn't jump straight to layer 3. It's just not going to work. You're going to get the value of going through the layers. But let's assume you're at the level of using the layers. Then in the Delta framework, we've come up with the idea that you, in terms of changing something about your research, so changing some levers, if you change 1 or 2, you can think of that as a minor pivot. Just a minor pivot from what you thought your research was going to be. A minor pivot might not work. It might not be enough. So you might need to amp it up even more and have a major turn. Not just a pivot, but a major turn. And what we're thinking about there is, well, anywhere from 3 to 6 of the levers you might have to change. That's quite dramatic. If you said, I need to change all 6, you're even needing or recognizing you need to change the research question, at least in some shape or form. But that then gets you to the point where it might be just a step too far, and that a major turn won't even work. You have to abandon. So it seemed when we were, I was working on this 2 or 3 days ago, and we managed to upload the paper to SSRN 2 days ago, that this 3-dimensional view would be very helpful. So if I'm going to change some levers, the first mode would be a minor pivot, a delta little m. So fine tune 1 or 2 of the levers. For example, you might say the key papers that I'm relying on are too old. I've got to find some much more recent key papers, and that's going to help me make a case for why my paper is important, or the idea. So 1 or 2 levers to lift novelty or clarity. As I said, that may not be enough. You might need to go to a delta capital M, a major turn. So you might need to re-engineer multiple layers, and the most extreme cases where all 6 levers you feel you need to change. But if you're getting to that level, that starts to, I think, suggest that there could be major issues with your research, and you might get to the final level, and we have to be honest, we have to be realistic, we have to recognize sometimes things don't work out and we need to abandon. And this is, this is part of responsible science. Don't hang on to something beyond a point where it's just not going to work in some reasonable sense. So when impact and feasibility collapse, responsible termination becomes the most scholarly action. Now, I don't want to whiz you, sort of make you think that I'm going to present something mathematical here, but there is a modeling that I think is quite neat way of explaining what this delta model is sort of trying to do. So if you think of the pitch in this basic model, the pitch is this set of 11 things, working title, research question, right through to other considerations. And as I've started to talk to you now about the 3 really the value drivers of what's new, so what, and contribution, we're putting a label in the Delta paper, the Delta framework, we're calling that impact. Okay, so impact is a function of those 3. And it's not like there's an exchange rate in there, or there could be some degree of trade-off. I don't know. It's very qualitative. It's not like there's a formula that you can express here, and you can't measure these quantitatively. It's more conceptual. So the impact is a function of those 3 elements, and the levers are the 6 things that you have direct line of sight decision making over. You decide what the research question is. You read the literature and decide what the key papers are. You read the literature and absorb everything and decide what the motivation is. You figure out what the idea is. You need to decide what the data is and the accessible data is, and you need to figure out the tools. They are all direct decisions and levers that you have, and powerful and exciting levers that you have in your toolkit. So the idea here that really we've got in mind is you want to optimize on the impact by decisions you make around these 6 levers. And the trigger for doing something is around your perceived view of your impact relative to what your target impact is. So near the bottom, the second last line of this slide, impact star is denoting the target, the target impact you have in mind. And again, we can't quantify it, so it's very conceptual. It's quite abstract, but I think to me it makes sense. So the trigger is if the impact that you assess, so the left-hand side there, the impact at time t is less than your target impact, that's telling you that you haven't quite made it. Maybe the trigger there is that your supervisor basically says the novelty is not good enough, and so your impact is less than impact star. And reminding ourselves that there are these feasible boundaries, and the other considerations are intact, but they're sort of adding constraints. There are constraints. It's not an unconstrained problem. So if the impact is the function of the what's new, so what, and contribution, one can think of, and so in this Delta paper, and this is very fresh, and I mostly like what is stated here, but it's not, it shouldn't be taken as like a hard and fast sort of characterization. So we've landed on the idea that what's new you can think of is probably mostly a function of the research question, the key papers, and the idea. And intuitively that appeals to me. Think of key papers. So the key papers that ultimately to judge the novelty, if you identify 3 key papers, that's what you're benchmarking against. If they are very new and they should be fresh key papers, then your novelty is benchmarked against the key paper. So the intuition there, I'm completely on board with, but as I said, it's not like black and white. It's not hard. This is a characterization that I think can help us think through how we can improve our research planning and the use of the pitching research framework. The suggestion is that the so what is a function of the motivation, the idea, and the data, and that the contribution is a function of the research question, data, and tools. So here's a Venn diagram that captures that quite neatly. So, for example, we have idea in the intersection of what's new and so what. We have data in the intersection of so what and contribution, and we have a research question in the intersection of what's new and contribution. And it's the idea, the research question, and the data that turn out to be the golden triangle, because they're the golden triangle because if you buy into this characterization, if you change idea, for example, you're going to get a benefit both in the what's new direction and the so what direction. If you change and alter in a positive way, and it's a successful change of your research question, you can quite easily conceive of a benefit in terms of what's new and contribution. And likewise with data, it's in the intersection of so what and contribution. If you don't make an improvement, a realistic improvement, and a feasible improvement in data and the sampling, then you can see potentially a benefit in the so what and contribution. So those dimensions of the impact. So if we then, with all of that, come back to thinking about the 3 levels of change. So the minor pivot column there, the second column, if the impact deficit, in other words, your assessed impact is not very much lower than the desired impact, then it's small, and that would be consistent with a minor pivot. If, however, the impact deficit is large, there's clear underperformance, then it's really a major turn that you need to do. And of course, if there's a persistent gap, and it's a massive gap, and you feel like you have to change all 6 levers, you're probably heading in the direction of abandonment. So, so we're getting near the end of the talk. I just want to say one more thing on the delta model, and then I'm going to say spend 5 minutes or so on the amping up the idea, which dovetails into what we've been talking about here. But again, this might seem overly abstract. So I want to try and bring some reality, some situations that we would encounter. So the first column are the symptom column are like these situations. So what's the first one say? It says, it feels like the data, it feels dated and not frontier. So let's say, you might get that, let's imagine we're at a conference and someone, you give your presentation, someone in the audience says, hey, this feels dated, it's not frontier, well, that sounds like novelty, doesn't it? So the likely impact function weakness is G1. It's a weak what's new. What's new is low. And the levers that we should adjust according to that Venn diagram would be key papers, idea, and occasionally RQ. I think, because RQ is so central, the research question, remember, in terms of the radial model, it's right in the core, it's the anchor. If we change that anchor, we're really starting to create some turbulence around our research. So we want to resist that if we can. And so feels dated, not frontier. In the final column, the delta type, the change that we would sort of think might work there is probably just a small delta, a delta lower M. What about the second case? Relevance unclear, audience unconvinced. So the suggestion is the likely impact function weakness, the second column, is a G2. It's saying, well, so what? I mean, the audience are thinking, it's just not doing it for us. Now, if we want to try and fix that, where should we go? Well, the Venn diagram is saying, reconsider your motivation. Have you really identified the strongest motivation you can, and maybe you might need to change your research question to help with that. I don't know. The idea, can you strengthen the idea in some way? And this dovetails into the amping up paper that I want to quickly mention to finish the talk today, because it's sort of like, well, okay, if I've got to do something with the idea, what do I do? Have I got any advice for you? Well, I have some advice, and that's where we're going to go to in a minute. And the third one there is maybe something to do with the data for the relevance unclear. What about the third row there? Execution sound but not publishable. So this one's trying to head us in the direction of, well, the contribution's low. And so you might change the levers you might think of there, data, tools, and possibly RQ. And that's probably heading you in the direction of a major turn. And the final one is sort of the worst case. It's concept impossible to test. If someone said to you, the concept you've got is impossible to test, that's like the death knell. So there's basically nowhere to go. If they're right, all the levers are useless and you would abandon. All right, so let's now. So I've already given a bit of a hint of why I think we need the amping up series of papers, and I'm going to so my focus is on the golden triangle. So I'm going to do an amping up, and at the moment, I've only got the idea, the amping up the idea, but my plan is to do an amping up of the research question and an amping up of the data, because they're the golden triangle. Okay, so what's the amping up What have we got to offer in terms of amping up the research idea? So it's knowing when to push, pause, or avoid. Okay, push, pause, or avoid. And I mentioned that earlier. And just to focus your attention on how we would get ourselves to this point of we want to amp up the idea is either we're getting advice or feedback that the novelty's not good enough or the so what's not good enough, because idea can help with both of those. And that's why I've circled it there in pink. All right. So great. How can I help you? Well, here's a quick case example. So imagine a situation where a team of corporate finance researchers are considering importing network centrality measures from sociology to study board interlocks and information diffusion. So this is one of the strategies we cover in the Amping Up paper, and that is importing a concept from another field. And in fact, this has been done. This importation of networks and centrality of networks, we're already seeing in finance papers, and this is, I guess, an indication of the success of that type of strategy. So in that sense, there's a green tick. Done well. This is a textbook push. The borrowed concept directly strengthens the idea without losing disciplinary identity. Now, but there's a red cross there as well, just to remind us, if it's misapplied, it becomes noise and confusion. So there's a little message to say, while I can give you advice, you need to be careful not to fall for the trap of thinking, oh, I should borrow something from somewhere. That'll work. It might work, but it may not work. So one of the devices we've got in this amping up paper is a 3x3 framework in terms of amping up the idea. It's not the only thing, but that's what I wanted to quickly share with you to whet your appetite in the remaining minutes of this talk. So each case in this 3x3 represents a specific intersection between an amplification lever and a timing context. So what's the amplification lever? So dynamism. So can we make a case for there being a dynamic relation as opposed to a static one? Second possibility is, should we focus on some sort of optimal variable, optimal concept, as opposed to just a crude or raw variable? And the third possible strategy is around conditionality. So can we get any benefit in terms of the idea of making it a conditional relation as opposed to an unconditional relation? So that's three. That's the first part of the threesome. The other three are the timing. That is, do we push? Green light. Do we pause? Orange light. Or do we avoid? Red light. So I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to work with this first case, which is the dynamic versus static. And then I think I'll close it because it is getting late and I want to leave some time for questions. But in terms of the dynamic versus static, so let's take the push row first. So what's the scenario for a push? So this is the most positive, it's a scenario that's saying, hey, you could push to go dynamic as opposed to a static. So the scenario is a study of corporate payout policies, models. Sorry, a study of corporate payout policies models adjustment speed toward target leverage over multiple policy regimes. So that's the dynamic element there is the multiple policy regime. So if it was If it was static, we wouldn't have that part in. It would just be models adjustment speed towards target leverage. And the pedagogical reflection there is that dynamics are enrich explanation. The mechanism involves reaction and adaptation, so motion clarifies theory. What about the pause scenario here, dynamic versus static? So the scenario, a novice researcher examines firm innovation before and after a single policy change, but lacks longitudinal consistency. In other words, there's inconsistency, there's only a before and after a single policy change. And in this case, the suggestion is that a dynamic frame is appealing and it may well work, but we shouldn't, the novice researcher shouldn't jump to that. So the suggestion is it's like an orange light. First secure clean before and after design before adding trend components. What about the avoid scenario? This one is where there's limited cross-sectional data that tempt a student to add lag structures without theoretical basis. So imagine a case where a student has gone to a seminar and been mesmerized by someone that has a great dynamic sort of story and a dynamic setting, and they come away from it thinking, oh, I'm going to do that for mine. I think I'm just going to force it to be dynamic. And their situation is there's very limited cross-sectional data, but they're tempted to add lag structures. And the pedagogical reflection here is that dynamics add noise and spurious precision. So a simpler static framing would yield clearer insights. And so that's a red light. That's absolutely a red light. Well, there's an optimal versus raw version there. I'm just going to skip over that. You can read it in the paper, conditional versus unconditional. I think with that, I'm going to draw my comments to a close. I've gone about 20 minutes longer than I planned, but I still can stay up a little bit if there are any questions. So thanks very much for your attention. I've covered a lot of territory there. This is brand new, particularly the final layer. As I said, the two papers only got uploaded in the last 4 days, 6 days. I'm very excited to present it to you. It's the first time I've presented it, and you know, whenever you present something for the first time, it's a bit tricky, but I was quite pleased by how that came out, and I will definitely polish up on that as time goes on. But thanks very much. Happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Robert Faff, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Now, if anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Yes, there is questions here. The 5 golden rules are a powerful foundations for a researcher. Which rule do you find is most often neglected? And what is the single most effective exercise to stress it in a draft pitch?
Okay, so if I understand the question, so I think that it's to do with the golden rules, and I'm just reminding myself I've got the slides back up, but I'm not sharing them. So clear and focused, meaningful, effort-based, connected internally, and start a conversation. Look, it's a bit hard to say which might be the biggest failure or the most common, but probably the one that I'm going to comment on because I think it is neglected a bit, and that is the second last one, the connectivity. I think you know, particularly novice researchers don't stop to just stand back and look, and think about, well, you know, I've stated a research question, then I've run on to motivation, then I've run on to idea, and individually the elements seem okay, but they've actually, they've drifted. I think, it's easy, even, it's only 1,000 words, but even with 1,000 words, and if you do it over a few days, for example, so you start and then you drop it, you go to bed, you get up the next day, and it drifts. There's sort of a drift component where you've forgotten what the research question was and you start writing about something else, and then you just hand it in, or you ask someone to look at it, and so they go, oh, well, wait a minute, your research question was this, and now you're talking about that. So I think that's the one I would identify as sort of the one that could easily be forgotten.
Thank you. Are there other questions? If anyone have any questions, you can over mic and ask your questions. Paul?
Thank you, Professor Faff. Lovely to hear your voice and your thoughts. I would like to encourage you. You've written some wonderful works on research question matters. And you were saying you got a forthcoming paper. I'd love to see you integrate some of those ideas from your earlier papers into your push and all of that. And if possible, would you comment on voice and storytelling across all the elements of your golden triangle? Because sometimes I think people lose their voice when they come to the end of their work and they've forgotten what it sounds like, what motivated them has evaporated in the method section, in the data analysis. And they're trying to pick up the story again.
Yep.
And so sometimes that cohesiveness is difficult with 3 to 5 co-authors at times. It becomes difficult at times with ChatGPT because it changes the tone on me. So how do you get to that level of pivoting, which could be a minor delta or a major delta, in keeping that voice and authenticity and passion of research? Thank you for a lovely presentation.
Thank you. Look, I think it's just recognizing that it is an issue, and then there's no magic wand. It's once you recognize, and I think you're right. There can be that inconsistency in writing. I think it's more about the writing end of the process, which is all part of it, of course. And we particularly with deadlines. I mean, there always seems to be a deadline. Either the hard deadlines, which are externally imposed, are sort of really nasty ones, because it's sort of like, we got to get this in, and so sometimes even with 5 co-authors, and that can exacerbate, as you pointed out. It's you might think, well, there's 5 of us to share the load, but that inconsistency can creep in, and you're rushing to, there's a deadline for a special issue or whatever, or a conference. But even the soft deadlines we impose on ourselves, like, we must get this. I've often had over the years one, towards the end of the year, and you sort of, living in the southern hemisphere, thinking about summer and a summer break at the end of the calendar year. It's sort of like, I've got to get this paper in before Christmas. Submit it to a journal. It's just a soft imposed deadline, and maybe it's in those circumstances that you can run out of puff. Where you see that a bit, I reckon, is we tend to leave an abstract until the end. We might have like a placeholder of an abstract, along the way when we're writing, and then it's sort of like, and everyone's, you run out of steam, and there's a deadline. It's like, oh gosh, we got to revise the abstract. Now these days, you can, you mentioned ChatGPT or generative AI. They can pretty much do a great job for us. But in the old-fashioned days, where it was, you didn't have that luxury, you could often see where the abstract was the last thing that the researchers did, and it was pretty ordinary. So, I think it can happen in any part of the paper, and it's just a matter of the research team acknowledging that it is an issue and finding time to actually deal with it towards the end.
Are there other questions? If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your questions. There are questions. Could you elaborate on the key signals a researcher should use to identify that the abandon is the most scholarly choice rather than just perceived failure?
All right, so I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I think it is something to do with the abandoned,
Yeah.
you know, when we're in that zone of, and it's the nasty, you know, it's like the nightmare situation of, you know, coming to the realization that doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to get to a level that you feel, you know, for example, that the threshold sort of impact could be a perception about what is necessary to get into one of your target journals. And oftentimes these days, you know, a lot of universities are saying, well, Q1, you know, any Q1 journal. So it's sort of like, oh, well, what do I need to do in terms of what's new, so what contribution, that combination, the perception of those, what do I need to do to get to a combo of those that a Q1 journal that is in my field will be interested. And I guess, you know, in the end, I think it's easy to convince ourselves, well, we might, you know, it could be, we might have an outside chance. We don't know. We'll never know unless we try. It's not like you can't evaluate. It's not like it's judgmental. It's qualitative. So, so when I mention the abandonment case, it's not so much that you can't definitively say it for sure that you should abandon, but I guess you can see signs like, you know, it's hard to get in that circumstance because it's bad news. It's going to be hard to get anyone to give you honest opinion. So let's say you've got a fairly ordinary paper and you show a variety, you know, a selection of academics and say, oh, could you read my paper? And it's likely, you know, it's really tough to say to someone, I don't think this is very good. So they might just politely say, oh yeah, it's okay, blah blah blah. But if we have a group, you know, a group within your network where you come to you know, an understanding, we're going to cross-pollinate advice amongst our papers. You know, some of the papers we're working on together, but others we're not. And we need to be honest. And we don't want to be nasty and you know, and go out of our way to say something's bad if we don't, you know, if we're not quite sure. But I think that's what you know, we probably somehow need to develop that circumstance so that we can, I don't know, we probably don't abandon enough of the papers that should be abandoned. And one way of thinking of this is there's an opportunity cost. So if you hang on to an ordinary paper for too long, it's not cost-free. It takes time to hang on to those papers. You know, you rewrite an ordinary paper for the 17th time, and ultimately, you know, you may find a home for it, but it's not Q1. It's like Q3 or whatever. So what does that cost you? That's cost you valuable time that you could divert to a much better project. So, you know, I think the reason for having it there is more than just to be exhaustive, because it's sort of like you know, sort of like a minor pivot, a major turn, or abandon. Like if we didn't have abandon, there's something missing. So it needs to be there in terms of completing the space, but it also needs to be there just to I guess give encouragement to us all to sometimes take the bitter pill and say, right, I've invested in that. It's like a sunk cost. And the other thing to remember there is it's typically never a total abandonment. That would be like disaster. You know, you spend months and months and months on a paper, and then you just say, this is so horrible. It's not going to lead to anything, and I've never learned anything from it. That never happens. So what, you know, you might abandon a paper, but there's something that grows out of that. It might be a little indirect that leads you to a much better paper. So, you know, I think all of those sorts of consideration need to be remembered.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. There is a lot of questions. If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your questions. Another
Maybe if I could, you know, I think it's getting late, so if we could maybe just try if, you know, one or maybe two more, and then I do, you know, I do have to go to bed.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Robert Faff, for your contribution and your effort. Thank you, everyone, join us today, and thank you very much for taking the time to present to us, dear Professor Robert. It's been appreciated.
My pleasure. Thank you, and wish everyone a good day and good luck with your research. And I hope to get the chance to visit you in Egypt sometime. So
You are very, very welcome, dear Professor Robert Faff.
okay, well, stay in touch and good luck with your webinar series.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Okay,
Goodbye.
right. Goodbye. Bye.